Hey, everybody, and welcome to The Index. I'm your host, Alex Kehaya, and this week I'm excited to welcome Jake Brukhman, founder and CEO of Coinfund, an investment firm focused on investing in venture and liquid opportunities and supporting visionary founders within the AI and blockchain sector. Jake, you've been on the show before, so we're not going to focus on your earlier background because people can go back and listen to that episode, but I'm really appreciate you taking time to talk to us today. The thing I'm really excited about hearing more of your opinions on is the intersection of AI and blockchain technology and Web3 in general. Yeah, so maybe we can start there. Like, you've been tweeting a lot about this. It's been something I've been exploring myself as well. What are you seeing that you're excited about at that intersection? What's the future looking like to you?
Awesome. Thanks, Alex. Thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to be back. And you're totally right. I think 2023 was really the year when AI kind of intersected with crypto or Web3 as a narrative, and kind of got on people's radars. But I almost want to, like, before we dive specifically into that, I almost want to take a step back, because what people usually say is that when they hear such things, when they hear like the intersection of Web3 and AI, it sounds like a gimmick. It sounds like AI is hot, everyone's trying to do something in it, and we're unnecessarily putting labels on, what we're doing in Web3 to seem more cool. And I think that is cannot be farther from the truth. And the reason I think that is because when I started CoinFund and started looking at crypto stuff, and especially like around 2015 when we were sort of forming the CoinFund thesis, like, it was always a lot of people at that time were focused on blockchains for sovereign money. And I was actually doing the opposite. I asked the question, as I was starting CoinFund, like, what is blockchain good for beyond that? And I think the thesis that we formed, at a high level, is that blockchain is this sort of decentralized ledger technology that would go and kind of disrupt various verticals. And the real question was, like, which verticals were sort of ripe for disruption, which verticals would be like totally new and created by it, and which verticals would sort of be, a worse fit perhaps, or just take longer to absorb blockchain. And so I just want to say that, because kind of our fundamental point of view at CoinFund is that Web3 is a technology that comes to different areas and creates intersections with them, right? We've seen Web3 for finance, that's called DeFi. We've seen Web3 for digital collectibles, that's called the NFT space. And now we're seeing Web3 AI. And so to me, this intersection was always like a natural, almost like inevitability of things that would happen as Web3 sort of developed and put forward these value propositions of self-sovereign data, of privacy, of security, and so forth. Now, to go back to my personal experience with AI, I studied math and computer science, so I was always like aware of the AI field as I was studying, and as I was going out to work. I actually remember even using some AI concepts back in, must have been 2012 or 2013 or so, where I was using machine learning to measure Twitter sentiment in an effort to like trade stocks or something like that. And there was actually even a hedge fund that went ahead and like made a whole strategy based on that. Of course, they a few years later didn't quite make it and went out of business. But
Oh, no.
that is all to highlight like how far we've actually progressed in the field of AI with things like ChatGPT. And so, as I have been following AI over the course of these many years, what started to become obvious, I don't know, like late 19, early 20, things like that, we started to hear rumblings about AI language models starting to make some progress. And really, in retrospect, the first investment that we made in this intersection was at the end of 2020, and that was our investment in WorldCoin, which is, of course, Sam Altman's Web3 project, and is aimed at creating a proof of personhood that, among other things, could be used to disambiguate, AIs and humans, and create an identity protocol, and so on. And our next investment was in March of 2022 in a company called Jensen AI. And what Jensen was doing at that time is that they said, well, we want to democratize compute, and in particular, we want to enable training in more of a decentralized way. And I think what they meant functionally by that was in a more available way to any participant in the market that wants to work with AI training, um, but also in the sense of being trustless, in the sense of being able to go to a network and simply request and pay for the service, and be like very sure that you would get a service here, which is very different than the way that like the big tech companies sort of operate here. At the time, in March of 22, if you asked, most AI people, is Jensen a good idea? And of course, this is coming on kind of the back of like GPT-3 and large foundation models being developed and sort of making a splash. Most AI people would say, well, it's kind of strange that you would opt for such a thing, because when you start to decentralize training, you're going to make it slower, you're going to make it more inefficient, and really, like, we were able to achieve the scale of these large models because we're stretching every dimension that we have. We're stretching the theoretical dimension, to make these algorithms tractable by GPUs. We're stretching our ability to create like large GPU clusters and data centers, and really, to them at that time, slowing that process down didn't quite make sense. Now it's 2024, and now, we've had a chance to live with products like ChatGPT and large language models and generative AI for art and video and 3D and other areas. And we have already faced a number of sort of challenges to privacy. Like, for example, artists have become aware that their data is being used for training some of these models. In fact, the New York Times recently famously has sued OpenAI and Microsoft for using AI articles in their training. Um, and we also are getting this sense that, if LLM like agents or assistants um, are becoming, or are poised to become so useful to us and even better than us at performing tasks, then this creates a danger to our data. These LLMs become poised to pull in more private data from us than even Google and Facebook, et cetera, have done in the past, right? And so now, from this vantage point of 2024, thinking about how Web3 intersects with AI and provides primitives for compute, for open collaboration, for open source, for privacy of data, for privacy of computation, and so forth, suddenly this has become really prescient. And there's a growing number of startups and different opportunities and networks, and also Web2 startups that are concerned with that problem. So let me pause there, because I know that was a lot as the backstory, but
No, you're
that's
on
kind of
point.
how I frame Web3 in my mind. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as I've been exploring this, I think you probably know this from my background, but I've been kind of obsessed with hardware in the last couple of years, but specifically like the physical backbone of the internet, right? So the data centers all over the world that make things like AI work. And how do you like one of the big questions I've been asking myself since I got into crypto in 2016 is like, how do you deploy the physical infrastructure for a decentralized network in as many data center locations and ASNs on the planet? Like, how do you create a really censorship resistant and decentralized network? And it's something I've spent a lot of time thinking about, and basically most of my work in the space has been focused on that. And so I think, with DePIN, things like these decentralized compute networks, they're starting to answer that question. Things like Jensen, right, of how you actually get the physical infrastructure that then can compete with these larger companies, right? I think I saw on Twitter, Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, some screenshot of a tweet he did or something, where they had this ridiculous amount of GPU capacity that they had purchased, something like 300,000 plus GPUs.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's
Right.
really hard to compete with. And as I've been exploring this and starting to look at, like, I'm still learning about AI. Like, I know I'm not a computer scientist, but I know like the basics of the different pieces of what makes an AI work. And the thing that I keep coming back to is data. The data ownership is the biggest piece of this that I think, well, two things: data and also access to GPUs. I think that there is this. If you talk to like a big data center company today, they're going to tell you there's like a 52-month wait or something for an H100 chip. So there's this belief in the sort of Web2 space, in the traditional data center space, that GPUs are hard to come by. But actually, I think that's where Web3 is starting to really disrupt the market, is that there are a lot of GPUs that you can get access to at scale if you can leverage token economics and a protocol to access them through. Um, the other piece that I think that many companies are missing, like enterprises that are looking at using AI in their business, is their data. They don't, when they partner with like OpenAI or Anthropic, those are like the two bigger competitors in the space. They're handing their data over to the AI owned by those two companies, and it's not their AI. And I think that the
Mm-hmm.
really cool thing, if you talk about a timing standpoint, you're talking about 2024. There are Jensens, there are Akash networks, there's Render, there's a bunch of different infrastructure layers that are getting built out. And then you look at the open source LLMs that are out there, like Llama 2 and things like that, OpenChat, GPT for all, right? You're starting to get things that are not quite as good as OpenAI. But they're like a GPT 3.5 equivalent. Um, and I'm getting excited because I'm starting to see a way to weave all these things together that you can actually achieve like the end-to-end solution of different products that different products would need to get built that actually leverage AI in a decentralized fashion. Um, I do think that the data privacy piece is that's the one that the big blocker that I keep running up against. Like I haven't anytime I go to like a Web2 company that wants to get access to GPUs that are cheap, and they start talking about like using one of these decentralized network, they're always like, well, what about my data? How do I protect my data? And maybe Jensen solves for this. I would love to hear if you have seen some solutions, but I know that like ZKP, zero knowledge proof technology, is like one potential area that could solve for the data privacy piece, but it's not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily like bi-directional. That was something I was told by like another engineer. So there's like an issue there that I'm not fully versed on yet. It's like an area of exploration for me. But I guess like long story short, I'm still trying to figure out where the privacy preserving technology is that's in the middle of all this, that allows you to maintain ownership of your data or privacy of your data
Yeah.
and train it on an open network on a server you don't necessarily control. Like, have you seen a solution to that yet, or what are the solutions we should be looking for? Like, what's needed that doesn't exist yet?
Yeah, this is a great question, and it really, I appreciate it, Alex, because it really digs into the technical details of what is happening here. So maybe we could get a little bit like nuanced. Well, when you hit, like, kind of to your point, when you hit the OpenAI API, that is an API that is run by, this corporate entity, OpenAI, right? And it's run in their kind of proprietary like server environment. And when you send them your query, your prompt, your data that's associated with it, right? This is something that they kind of take custody of and um, and process for you, and in principle could be storing or could be using in other ways, depending on what they say in their terms of service, which seems to be changing quite often.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's sort of the default, right, that we're used to in Web 2. If you store documents in Google, they're your documents, but in some sense, in some very strong senses, they're not yours. They're used for improving Google. They're used for government subpoenas. They're employees internally could potentially look at them and have, and so on. So the question you're kind of asking is like, when we go into Web3 world, how does this change? It's a really good question, and it's actually like a really difficult problem, because if you think about, so let's define some terms here. So when you are using an AI model, when there's an AI model that exists, you send it some input and it gets you output. That's called inference. And a lot of Web3 is actually focused on this process of inference. We have these open models or maybe proprietary models. How can we get you the outputs of those things, in the form of a decentralized network? And the thing that you have to realize is that when you are dealing with a decentralized network, you're still dealing with a third party that is running the node that is doing the computation, that you're sort of asking for. Now, we can argue that that perhaps is a better setup than having that counterparty be like a big tech company who has a lot of attention, power over your data. But it's still the case that that your counterparty in that network sees your input potentially, right? Sees your output potentially, can store that information, and so on. And I think like one attempt in this area to create more sort of options for privacy has been called ZKML, zero knowledge machine learning. And what zero knowledge machine learning basically says is that I can produce this inference, this output of the model, and I can also produce a zero knowledge proof that that output is correct. And generally, what that allows a decentralized network for inference to do is to first of all solve the verification problem, like solve, let the consumer know that their problem is being solved or their query is being computed correctly, which is really important. When we go to Google, we have a lot of trust in Google as a kind of legal entity to give us such guarantees. And when they fail on them, we have certain like legal recourses. In the case of a Web3 network, perhaps what's more prescient is that we have cryptographic guarantees that this output is correct. And the other thing that ZKML allows such a network to do is actually to have different levels of knowledge about the model. So here's what I mean. I mean that it could be a totally open model whose weights are known, or it could be a proprietary model whose weights are unknown. So it
What are the
actually
weights?
supports.
Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So the difference between like an open source and a closed source like neural network is what is a neural network? It's a bunch of nodes and a bunch of connections between those nodes that have numbers associated with them. Essentially, it's a big data file. That's what a neural network is. In the case of something like Stable Diffusion 1.5, for example, which is a generative art model, all those numbers are known. In the case of OpenAI, ChatGPT, we have no idea, like, is that one model? Is that five models? What are the weights? How do they interact together? Like, it's a black box.
Mm-hmm.
And my point that I'm making is that using ZKML, you can actually create situations where an open model is being served or a proprietary closed model is being served. And I would argue that that's good because it supports like every possible, business model. So I could be, a proprietor of some kind of private model, and yet I could still give guarantees to my consumers that their output is correct. So I think like largely speaking, like the way that ZKML and inference networks work today is they trust minimize and they sort of like maximize privacy, but they're still like not a perfect solution to privacy in the sense that your counterparty still has to compute your data, right? And to get to a point where the counterparty does the computation but doesn't know what you're computing, doesn't know your input, doesn't know your output, that's a very hard problem that people are working on in the FHE space. But I don't think it's like very efficient today. I don't think that that's like a reasonable expectation to have from a network. So it's an improvement on privacy. Now you could also say, like, in the case of open models, is it so important? Like privacy in some sense becomes less important, right? Because the models are open, but it might still be important in the sense like I don't want you to know which pictures I'm generating. But like we've made progress, in other words, toward private networks, but we're not quite there. And I want to say one last thing: these mechanisms like FHE, fully homomorphic encryption, or zero knowledge proofs are still very heavyweight primitives today. They're very like complex to compute.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they add latency latency to these requests, they add cost to these requests. And so you are getting this increased level of privacy, but with a trade off of efficiency. And also, that efficiency could be fatal in the following sense. Like, um, you could have a model, but because of the inefficiency of ZK, that model can't be too big. Like, it would be exceptionally cost inefficient to compute an output of a model the size of GPT-4 or something like, with hundreds of billions of parameters. And in fact, the state of the art of ZKML right now is computing a model with just a few million parameters, and that's it,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
If you wanted to actually do chatbots and LLMs on chain, you would have to go to a different strategy than ZKML. It's just not feasible. And that strategy, or one of the strategies that has been offered, is something called OPML, which is called optimistic machine learning. We could talk about that, but long story short, it's a way where like someone gives you the output and someone else checks them.
Mm-hmm.
And if their check fails, then they pay a price. So it's similar to what like optimistic rollups do versus
Yeah.
like ZK rollups.
Interesting. Yeah, I find this problem fascinating because I have run up against so many different use cases where the privacy piece is what's prevented an end customer or an end consumer of using like a decentralized network. But I think that because right now they have there's two options. If you can find a solution that works on a decentralized network, you could use that for your AI use case, whatever it is. The other option is like an enterprise is to use something like a virtual private cloud or do things on premise and then use open source software. And in that sense, you really do own the AI because the data that you're putting in there is your data. No one else has access to it. So you can own your AI. That's the way I've started thinking about it. And,
Oh,
uh,
totally.
and I think
I
that's
was just
that.
going to say,
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
oh, so, well, I was just going to say, like, yeah, like my conception of like when you think about like LLMs as personal assistants, like one of the questions is, how do I make this product like totally private, right? Like if I'm using ChatGPT, I know my data is going over there, like blah blah blah, and like my conception of like a private LLM assistant is when you own your data locally in a self-sovereign way, and when you also own the model locally, you're able
Mm,
to like fine tune or augment the model with your data, but in a totally local way,
mm,
so that it never leaves your sort of premises, right? Um, and then that creates kind of a like a really high degree of privacy in terms of other people using your data.
But let me ask
But
you this:
have
in
we
that use
achieved
case,
that? Not
can you
really.
still append it with external data if it's running? I mean, in that ideal scenario, you've got because there's other data that can be a model could be trained on, right? Like that's publicly available or that you poured in through it via API, but you don't want to expose your data, and so your like local instance can then benefit from because the more data you have, the more powerful the AI is. Like the more data it's trained on, the better it is, right? So if it's got your local data and you've got your local instance, but it can still talk to that that external version. I mean, is that something that's possible, or are there going to be more risks there to your? It's not exactly private if you do that.
Um, so there's a few strategies that make kind of like core LLM models smarter. So one strategy would be like fine tuning it on extra data and making it sort of more specialized toward that data. I think that is generally difficult. It requires a lot of compute, requires knowing the ins and outs of a particular model. I mean, it's feasible that there would be services that help you streamline that, but it feels expensive to do that because of the compute. Another, and this is actually how a lot of augmentation works today, is that like if you've ever played, for example, with OpenAI's GPT's facility,
Mm-hmm.
it's sort of like a specialized prompt for GPT-4 together with extra documents that it could process. So the question is like, how do those documents like enter the system? And I think the answer, I don't know exactly how OpenAI does it, but in general, like the way that a lot of people put in extra data into models is through vector embeddings. As a matter of fact, this is the subject matter of one of our startups. I think I could say it now because it's going to be announced tomorrow, probably before
Yeah,
this
this won't come
podcast
out
airs.
then.
But
Yeah.
we're leading around in a company called Bagel Network, and Bagel has created essentially like a vector embeddings facility with a Web3 open collaborative kind of business model. And like think like GitHub, but for LLM data. And the
Amazing.
way what you could do is you could take you could take your personal data and you can feed it into this embedding, and by doing that, you're making it essentially parsable and processable by the
Hmm.
LLM, right? Um, so a lot of people have made models smarter that way, and I think that as that data and as those embeddings kind of become either more local to your premises or maybe still out there in the cloud but encrypted, like with a high degree of permissioning
Hmm.
and self sovereignty of like who gets to like see it, then users are going to have much greater privacy securities and much more control over like what LLMs kind of get their data.
I'll have to check them out. I think it's the guys behind GPT-4 that they're like GPT-4 all was, or maybe it was Open Chat. I can't remember which one. I got to go look. But like their whole actual primary business model is vectorizing data for AI use cases. They have like a service that does that for companies. And for people listening who don't know what
Mm-hmm.
that is, it's just like data comes in a lot of formats, and you need to format it so that an LLM you can feed it to an LLM, right? Like it has to be in some kind of standardized format. Correct me if I'm wrong, but
Yeah, that's right. That's right. At a high level, that's right.
and so Bagel like allows me to do this in a decentralized way. And then do I actually own, if I'm like the data provider, am I getting compensated for that in this scenario? Or is it just like a more like I'm paying for the vectorization service from like a decentralized network of providers that are doing the work for me?
There's a lot of details Bagel is yet to release, but the general idea is, yeah, that it's kind of an open marketplace, right? So if you I just I think back to like the 90s or early 2000s or something when people would sell databases of like US addresses or something for like
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
e-commerce.
mm-hmm.
I could see Bagel developing into an open marketplace where you're like, oh, okay, like here's the vector embeddings for all the addresses in the United States, or here's the vector embeddings for like all the species of animals that are in biology and
Amazing.
something like that, right?
Yeah,
Um,
that's super cool. So I'd like to so one thing is like I think there's a lot the bleeding edge of the data privacy thing is still in play, right? Like we don't have like a complete solution yet, and I think one of the things that I've been really interested in since like 2016 is just seeing the amount of money that's been invested in things like ZKP and ZKML and homomorphic encryption, and I think it's been I think an unintended side effect of the whole crypto and blockchain space is like so much money has gone into that technology. I don't think anybody I wouldn't have thought that would have been like a major area, but privacy became such a huge value prop of Web3, and so that's why it's been receiving so much attention. But moving away from just like AI, we talked about this before the show, but what are you most excited about in 2024? A lot has changed since last year. We kind of look like maybe we're coming out of the bear market and into a better market. A lot of things are up, but from a technology and startup standpoint, what do you think happens this year that Coinfund's excited about, or that you're just interested in personally?
well, one thing that's definitely like very visible to people who are studying the crypto space is that we continue to kind of merge and converge with the traditional world. So this month we've had in the beginning of this month, we had the SEC approve the first Bitcoin spot ETFs, which I think ultimately paves the way for more traditional finance participation in cryptocurrency, in DeFi, and crypto broadly. I think it paves the way for um, other kinds of ETFs for other assets like Ethereum, which are productive, and then eventually maybe even like Solana or something else. Um, at the same time, in 2023 at Coinfund, we backed Robert Leshner's project Superstate twice. And of course, Robert is working on RWA, real world asset tokenization. We've heard Larry Fink from CEO of BlackRock mention that, hey, these Bitcoin ETFs and other ETFs related to crypto are going to be just stepping stones on the road to tokenization. So it's hard to argue with the fact that the traditional world has picked up a narrative of tokenization and are very excited about it. We have a lot of very sophisticated institutional LPs that almost like the only thing that they want to talk about is like tokenizing treasuries and how impactful that's going to be, across the finance industry. What's interesting is like we've always kind of at CoinFund, like our thesis was always one of convergence, right? There's some people say like, oh, early on people would say like, hey, crypto is going to replace everything. And we always thought that was a little too drastic. I thought like to really get the benefit of, of adoption of blockchain technologies, it's not that blockchain would replace everything. It would like converge and create like new efficiencies and new options for, you know, governments and regulators and incumbents like banks. And that's actually what we pretty much are seeing happen this year with the Bitcoin test, with tokenization, and the maturing of some of these processes in industry. So that's just one thread, right? That we're thinking about very deeply and are very excited. And maybe just maybe one thought about why that's so exciting. I think that once more traditional investors, once Wall Street, once pension funds and hedge funds kind of start to get a taste of the kind of the idiosyncratic returns of something like a Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, they'll also start to have more influence on government to have more favorable, regulation, legislation for these things. And I just think that that's super bullish for crypto in the longer term. Some other areas that we talked a little bit about AI and Web3, and of course that's been a huge focus point and continues to be a focus point for me in 2024. Let me just say a little bit about like what we're actually investing in that space. Well, last year was very much about seeing the people attempting to democratize compute. So we've seen things like Akash, IONET, many other like open GPU networks. And a lot of our focus last year was around training and inference. I think like Jensen is probably the farthest along. I would argue in the world around thinking about decentralized training as a kind of academic problem. By the way, that investment was validated very much for us because over the summer they had a huge funding round. It's a $43 million
wow
round led by A16Z, and I believe we're the second largest check in that round.
Congrats.
And then
That's
we spent a lot
that's
of
always nice to see. Yeah.
Thank you. And then we also spent a lot of time on inference. So we made an investment in a company called Giza, which is giving AI inference to smart contracts. It's a little bit different than like AI inference APIs like in general, but I think like the opportunity on chain to use AI is also like very, very interesting because it's a new and an early market that is poised to like explode in a good way at some point. And then related to that, and we've had this discussion around ZKML, we also led around in a company called Sindri, which we announced recently. And Sindri is working on ZK proving, a lot of which is going to go toward applications like ZKML, right? And also rollups that are serving various AI applications. So in short, last year was very much about like the compute portion of the AI pipeline. This year, with our upcoming announcement of Bagel Network, I think we're going to start getting more into the privacy of data part, and like how do we get LLMs to run locally? How do we get data to be private? Maybe even a little bit about like the provenance of data. Do creators have a new business model where they opt in and out of sort of AI training in exchange for like royalties, for example, on their work? And I think a lot of that will also be adjacent to kind of like the outcome of that New York Times lawsuit, for example, and how are we supposed to think about AI training, from a copyright perspective out here in the world? So I think, this year we're looking a lot more at data related AI projects, and I'll mention like one more sort of thing in that genre, which is data availability layers. So we've heard a lot about Celestia. Celestia has had an incredible launch of their token, and there are many projects like IDEA, Avail, others that are very focused on creating data availability. But this type of data availability is really geared toward rollups. It's geared toward layer two. It's been optimized for that purpose. And what I'm thinking about is sort of something related but completely different, which is like, how do you optimize a data availability layer, but for things like zkML, for things like holding an AI model indefinitely at very low latency and being able to like verify it. Um, and so the optimizations in that layer that are required for example, AI inference are much different. Like the data has to stick around longer. It has to be low latency
It
on
has to be at the
high.
edge. I mean, it has to be at the edge, as close
Right.
to the edge as possible. And so, how do you get that there in a decentralized? I mean, that's the biggest question to me. Again, you go back to the physical infrastructure needed to execute that. Is it's just a huge shift.
Yep.
It's a huge shift from the current model, which is like data centers with, like Equinix owns a
Yep.
huge portion of the data center market. They're all over the world. Lumen, again, another company that's got data centers all over the world, and they used to run a third of the internet through their pipes, but it's all that shifting now. And
Yep.
the other thing I think is really interesting about that is they're all these companies are competing against Google and AWS and Azure for that compute to be as close to the user as possible, and it's a race to the bottom. They're all like getting out competed on price, and I think that decentralized networks are going to put even more pressure on that because in theory, will become cheaper for decentralized compute to offer like excess
Mm-hmm.
capacity into the market. Um, but yeah, like we talked about earlier, you still got to solve the data privacy piece to make that all kind of tie it all together, I think. Um,
Totally.
yeah.
And then maybe I'll mention like two more areas, and we can go on. But DePIN is a huge narrative right now.
Mm-hmm.
Decentralized physical infrastructure networks. Hey, we used to call them like resource networks or something, but got a new name. Um, what's really cool here is that just a few years ago, Alex, I think this was in like 22 or like 21. There are people who came out and said like kind of from Silicon Valley, and they said like, hey, like Web3 is dead on arrival
Yeah.
because nobody wants to run nodes in their home. And I think like DPIN is like dramatically like repudiating that. I think there's like over 1 million Helium nodes. People are buying Hive mappers. They're buying Solana phones. Um, there, there's a company in our portfolio called Demo, which allows you to reclaim your electric vehicle data by essentially buying a little device and plugging it into your car. And by the way, if you have a Tesla, you don't even need to do that. You just connect it to the API. But long story short, it turns out that there is actually a lot of people who are willing to run some kind of Helium device or Hive Mapper device or Demo device in their home. And I just wonder if that kind of keeps going and going and going until eventually someone aggregates all of these functionalities into a single piece of hardware that like every family has in their
Yeah.
home, in the same sense, as a computer, but it's their node on like the decentralized Web3 network, right? That would be the ultimate defeat of
I
the
agree.
Web3
I've been
bears
thinking
from
about this
22.
too. Is like, so two comments on that I think are important. One is, I think what this last cycle proved is that these deep in networks can survive a bear market. Like Helium, it was that wild ride, right? Like up through the top and then bam, like bottomed out, and people were probably not making money on those nodes for a long time, but they still kept them and like kept the network deployed, and it's starting to grow again. And so I think that was probably the big question of the bears, like, hey, does this have staying power? And I think the answer is yes. Like it definitely does. I mean, I think there's enough early adopters that believe, like the way I look at it is, at least in the case of Helium, it's like owning a piece of the railroad. I can install this tower at my house or just a hotspot, and I own a piece of the infrastructure of a future telecom, of a current existing telecom actually, because it's already live and working. Um, and then to your point about these, like a super box, I've been thinking of a bunch of different DPIN projects. I've been thinking of it as like a franchise model where you have like a business in a box, you can unwrap it, and it has like all the instructions for how to operate it, and you earn revenue off of it. And there's a company actually called Mycelium. Shout out to those guys. I've been talking to them for a while. Based out of, I think, North Dakota. They've got like 400 helium hotspots deployed all of North Dakota, and they've got a cool business model. They make money off of the devices, but they've also built a whole software stack around managing their fleet. And their fleet acts as a test bed for like an accelerator almost for other DPIN projects. So other DPIN projects can like give them a bunch of nodes to deploy, and now they're essentially kind of starting to form that like super node. You know, they might have like 5 different use cases at one location on their footprint, and I think that there's going to be similar to like the property management industry. I think at scale, there are going to be a bunch of like property management companies that come out and deploy these nodes at businesses, and they do rev share deals with businesses, and they've got like the franchise, you know, in a box that's run with a couple of layers of software on top for the management piece of it. And you'll start seeing it scale that way. You'll have like a bunch of individual consumers, hobbyists who run these things at their house, but you'll also have these more like professional operators, just like we've seen with the professional validator market, right? Where there's like these professional validator companies that validate on, you know, 100 different networks, along with the, you know, 1,000 individuals who do it as well. Yeah, so it's just like a really interesting path to adoption. And then, you know, I think the last thing I'm excited about too is RWAs are pretty interesting to me. I wrote a paper. I'll share it with you later if I haven't already, on the mortgage industry. And like 2 years ago, 3 years ago, like before I got into the Solana ecosystem, I was like, maybe I'll do something in mortgages. I'd bought a couple houses, like real estate investments, and uh, really hated the mortgage process. And the area that I landed
Mm-hmm.
where I thought that there would be low hanging fruit is the secondary market. If you could because people don't realize that mortgages are actually physical pieces of paper that the broker holds. And the second you you like buy a house and get a mortgage, they're on the phone selling it to somebody else, that piece of paper, and they're custodying that paper somewhere. It's a pretty inefficient market. There's been a couple players who've tried to tokenize mortgages before, and I think like, I don't know that it's going to be in the next like 2 years or something, but I do think it's something that will get tokenized eventually. And then there's a lot of benefits from like the ability to like automate distribution of payments and things like that through the network. But um, you know, I don't know if you have anything else to add to that before I ask my next question, but we're about to be at the top of the show.
Yeah, no, I would just add that, well, I would just say that that's a great use case for, for decentralization technologies, and like in terms of creating more efficiency, tokenization, all that stuff. So I would love to be in that world where mortgages are streamlined in that way.
Yep. So tell me about Miami. You're in Miami. I know there's an
Yeah,
ecosystem there. I have a couple of friends who live in the area. It just seems to me to be like this hopping center of Web3 and our space. But what's going on in Miami? Which, if you're in town visiting, where should you be looking? Who should you be talking to? That kind of thing.
totally. One of the reasons I moved down to Miami, it's not just because of the weather, which is great, but it's because I was around 2020, 2021, I was hearing this narrative that Miami is going to become more of a tech hub, more of a crypto center, and I'm an early adopter of things like that. So we came down here. Um, it has definitely it has definitely like made a lot of progress over that period of time until now. I think like when we just came down here, there was a lot of focus on trading tokens, like a lot of NFT folks were down here. I think over the course of us being here, CoinFund, first of all, we ran a monthly meetup for a time, um, where we would invite our portfolio company CEOs essentially to come and talk not just about like the tokens and the NFTs, but like how do they build their crypto business, and like how does it work? What are the entrepreneurship aspects of running a crypto network or a crypto company? Um, and then more recently, I think just the sophistication of folks in Miami has gone up. Like Again, Coinfund has been sponsoring these monthly happy hours. The attendance the last couple of times has been through the roof. Right now, we have one coming up in 3 days on Jan 25. We have over 205 people who've signed up for this.
Nice.
For this event. If you're in town, come by. They're always like really, really fun. And again, the like almost every or the majority of CoinFund portfolio companies, like someone on the team, is either in Miami or coming through. There are a ton of crypto managers down here, other than CoinFund, obviously. There's folks like Arrington, Hypersphere, Block Tower, Frictionless Capital, many, many others. And there's a lot of like really interesting kind of founders who just, some of them are like born and raised here, like Will Weinraub, who's the CEO of Cryptoys, which is a company in our portfolio, or Luca from Pudgy Penguins actually lives not too far from me down here in Miami, right? So it's just I think over the last couple of years, it's been quite an interesting community. It's been built up here, and I would say like, what is this community's challenge? I think the challenge is getting more engineers on the ground. So like, unlike New York, unlike Stanford or something, Miami has fewer kind of technical universities around, and so engineers tend to be imported from LATAM, from New York, from California, from Austin, and so on. So if you're an engineer and you're kind of Miami curious, like, come down, hang out at our happy hour, check out like the community here, and this is a great place to like headquarter a startup or just kind of like work out of Miami for a few months. That's what I would say.
Yeah, it's also, I'm not a CPA. This is not tax advice, but there are a lot more favorable taxes I hear in Florida than there are, at least in California where I live. So if you're already working in the crypto space and you're an engineer and you're doing well, it's a good thing to consider. I have several friends who are moving to the area just because of that. And it sounds like a good way to connect with your team is to show up at one of these meetups. Are they happening like once a month, or how often do you guys do these sponsored meetups?
Yeah, it's been once a month for the last 5 months. I'll shoot you over the link and maybe you could post it in the show notes.
100%. We'll do that. Well, listen, thanks so much. I know we're at the top of the show here. I appreciate your time, and thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks, Alex.